Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring highlights in the spiritualist literature. My guest is Maxine Meilleur, who is a spiritualist medium. She also has her master's degree in religion from Harvard University. She is the author of the 2-volume set called Great Moments in Modern Mediumship. Also, what the great mediums have taught us about spiritual healing, and what the great mediums have taught us about spirit guides, and what is spiritualism. Also, fascinatingly enough, grounds in your coffee, an idiot's guide to coffee tasseography, which is a form of divination involving reading the coffee grounds. This interview is being conducted with Maxine, who is in Kuwait. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Maxine. I'm very happy to be with you from so far away.
And I'm glad to be on your show, Jeff.
You have combined an academic career in the study of mediumship and trance experience with your own practice as a spiritualist, and I've discovered as a spiritualist medium yourself.
Yes, I have, Jeffrey. It's always been an interest of mine to both learn academically and experience firsthand this phenomena.
Well, you know, from your reports of the spiritualist literature, it's much vaster than I had actually imagined. And there are many, many highlights that I'd like to talk about. I think maybe a very good place to start is with Andrew Jackson Davis. He's a very important figure in the history of spiritualism, but largely, I think, forgotten today.
Yes, he is forgotten. But he was very big and he was very controversial at the time. Here he was an illiterate, uneducated, maybe past the 4th grade man who trained as a cobbler. In those days, men would pick up a skill, an internship in their teen years. So he had a very much of a blue-collar, working-class background. And then phenomena started to occur around him. And even though he was illiterate, he was highly curious and investigated this material. And he ended up, we would call it today channeling, but he wrote books while in the trance state that myself and a few other people tried to read them. It was obviously material beyond the reach of an uneducated cobbler. And he's forgotten in a large part also because he was a controversial figure. He married 3-4 times. In fact, he married a woman, he wasn't quite divorced before he was after a woman. And so within the mores of that society that put him in disrepute and made his work and his phenomena looked over.
I gather he's referred to by some as the John the Baptist of the spiritualist movement because he predicted the rise of what we now know as spiritualism, but he came before the Fox sisters, who are considered the founders of modern spiritualism. And yet he left a body of literature, and I gather that scholars came to observe his trance sessions and were very impressed with the quality of linguistic and scientific information that came through him.
they didn't have the words trance state, channeling back then. And it was very difficult for him to articulate what was going on. In fact, he coined the phrase, which is coming back into popularity now, called the superior condition. And we have no way of knowing what exactly he meant, what type of altered state he was actually in, or what abilities he had on the trance spectrum. But yes, he was tested or looked at by the science of the day.
He inspired people as far away as Russia. He became, one would have to say, an international figure.
Yes. And you alluded to the fact he predicted modern spiritualism. It is purported that on March 31st, 1848, he was in a trance state and said, "The doorway has been opened." And that was the date, of course, that the Fox sisters really took off with their phenomena in Hydesville, New York.
That's a very famous episode in the history of spiritualism. Many people who are familiar with spiritualism will know about it. So I'd like to jump over that a little bit and talk about Abraham Lincoln. It's well known, I think, that his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, was favorable to spiritualism and invited spiritualist mediums into the White House.
That is a fact, Jeff. That is a fact. The Orthodox religions of the day didn't have an answer to the afterlife. They had, your deceased loved one might go into purgatory or hell or waiting around for the judgment day. And that left so many people in grief unnecessarily. And so spirit mediums really filled the void at that time. And yes, there were mediums that came to the White House during the Lincoln and even the president before Lincoln. And President Lincoln was even purportedly on top of a piano as it levitated. So he may not have been into it as much as his wife or affected by grief as much as his wife was, but he was there front and center.
One of the most moving passages in your book was in reference to a medium who apparently went into trance and spoke to President Lincoln for, I gather, about an hour regarding the importance of him not delaying the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. And apparently that was very moving to Lincoln because he was under a lot of pressure from the more conservative forces at the time not to take this move.
Jeffrey, a case like that is exactly why I dug into the literature and investigated this for myself. Because if someone were to have told me 40 years ago, 20 years ago, that the Emancipation Proclamation came from a spiritualist medium, I would have said, what book did you get that out of? How do you know? And come to find out, for those listening to for the first time on this, it isn't just, the spirit medium was there and wrote a book about it. No. Biographers of Lincoln have found this story in other sources and have cited it. And there were cabinet officials in Lincoln's cabinet that looked down upon spiritualism and knew about this seance, and they wrote about it. So here you have a historical event that's not just referenced by one, but referenced by many. And so as a teenager, as a young adult coming into spiritualism, I would hear things but then I'd have an overwhelming curiosity of where is that? Who told you that? What book is that in? And that gave me the motivation as I was reading the spiritualist literature to get out a highlighter and say, oh, that's a great story. And to circle it and reference it by page and by book. And sure enough, that same story might be in another book that was earlier, or that was in another country. So it wasn't just copying the same story. Here you had a story coming from two different sources. And when you're doing academic research, postgraduate, you of all people know that a claim, a bit of evidence is not evidence unless it's cited.
Well, your 2-volume set on the great moments of modern mediumship includes, I guess it must be hundreds of examples of events that even today, after 150 years of spiritualism, probably the average person thinks these are impossible. They couldn't have occurred. Now, I know from the literature of parapsychology that these things are occasionally documented under well-controlled scientific conditions. But when you look at the reports of spiritualist circles, witnesses who have attended seances, it seems as if for every instance that occurs under scientific conditions, there are probably 20 or 30 identical reports under less well-controlled conditions, but they seem quite plausible.
Absolutely. And being a man of letters in the social sciences, you would know that these anecdotal stories, the hard scientists might scoff at a series of anecdotal stories, but anecdotal stories may form to be a giant case study, and case studies are fully recognized within the softer sciences of psychology, sociology, anthropology. So even though they're not under test conditions, every time, it doesn't mean that the evidence can't be replicated or duplicated. Now, there are problems within the softer social science about getting around the replication and the duplication of phenomena as opposed to the physical sciences. But psychologists have done that, and parapsychologists are getting into that. The problem is when you're dealing with consciousness, it's very difficult to devise controls that can be duplicated and replicated, and so that the evidence can be formulated and codified. Like the scientists want to see the evidence in a table form. So the only person who's really been able to do that within mediumship is I might mispronounce her name, Julie Bichel. And so she has a book on studying mediums, in which she had to devise a set of codifying data and then tabulating it and then replicating the phenomena across a series of mediums to support her theory. So it can be done. It's just a little tricky in the social sciences.
Well, let's talk about Apports. I did an interview with Stanley Krippner. He went down to Brazil and studied a Brazilian medium named Amir Amadin, who produced numerous Apports. They were witnessed under very good conditions. And as I recall, the objects that were apported are housed currently in a university in Canada. I know Stanford University in their museum. There's also a collection of objects that were ostensibly apported. But when you look at the accounts from spiritualists themselves, there must be 40, 50 different instances where apports have been attested to.
Yes, everything from apporting something within the cupped hands of a sitter, and not only apporting something within the cupped hands of a sitter, but having the item that's apported of evidential value or sentimental value to the sitter. So here you have some indication of intelligence. Okay. Now you raised the case of that man from Brazil, and that raises an issue, several issues actually, because I put parameters around my research in that I would only look at mediumship. And I defined mediumship as communication with the spirit world. Okay? And that infers dealing with an intelligent entity who just doesn't have a physical body. And that this phenomena, or all of this phenomena, is not random. Okay? Now, I would contend that the apports of Amir Amadan are random and without intelligence, and therefore not evidence of mediumship. And I go on to say someone that you know very well, or a research subject called Katie the Gold Leaf Lady. She apported metallic material right off her body. Okay? But how could you tell that production of this gold, it wasn't gold, but it looked like gold. How could you tell that this production of gold leaf off her body was spirit communication? There was no indication that it was spirit communication. And the apports of Amir Amadan, even though they're plentiful, are more PK than mediumship.
This has always been one of the problems for survival researchers in general, since we know that living individuals can produce psychokinesis and telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. How do we know when these are exhibited in a spiritualistic context that it's not really psi, as parapsychologists call it, produced by living individuals rather than disembodied spiritual entities?
Well, I would point to a medium called Estelle Roberts, and she's deceased now, but she was well known in the 20th century in the UK, and she wrote 40 Years a Medium and 50 Years a Medium. She was purported one of the mediums to go to Buckingham Palace, and she, for a very humble woman, she produced phenomena and had a client list that went into the royal family. And in her seances, she did not produce just apports. She produced a phenomena called direct voice, in that a voice was manifested not through her talking. It wasn't trance, but a voice would be heard from anywhere in the room, and the voice would be one of her guides or spirit controls by the name of Red Cloud, and Red Cloud would say, I have a man here in the spirit world, and he wants to bring a rose to his wife who is in the seance, and a rose would be apported to this woman's lap. So that is more of evidence in support of mediumship.
That's a very good example. You also describe numerous examples of spirit materialization, full-bodied in some occasions, spirit materialization. I think in one instance, the spirit materialized and remained present for some 20 minutes, allowing itself to be photographed.
Materialized entities have come in so solid that they have had a pulse, and they have asked sitters at the seance who were doctors to get out their stethoscope and take their pulse. And in an Alec Harris seance, an individual materialized so firmly that he said to one of the sitters, "Strike me in the chest," and I'm not a ghost, I'm not a phantom, strike me in the chest. And sure enough, the entity was struck, and evidence was given that it was so solid. Might I also say something, Jeffrey, because we get confused with terms. And whenever I hear this, either in a debate amongst skeptics or in a conversation amongst researchers, it's very important for people to understand that proof, the word proof, is not used in science. So science does not give proof. Science gives evidence. Proof is a mathematical term. You remember in high school we had to prove the Pythagorean theorem, but in science we gather evidence. So don't let someone talk about scientific proof. That's really an oxymoron. It's evidence, either in support of a theory or not in support of a theory.
Many people feel that the history of spiritualism is full of fraud, that there are all kinds of examples. I've experienced them. I bet you have too, of people who see this as an opportunity to take money from gullible people. And that has always been a kind of cloud hanging over the spiritualist movement. I wonder how the various, especially when it comes to things like materialization of spirits and apports, what are some of the best arguments with, let's take spirit materialization, that would counteract the argument of fraud? To me, one of them is that when the materialized spirit appears and can be touched, as you point out, that then the witnesses actually witness the entity dissolving right in front of their eyes.
Exactly. And it also goes to, can it be reproduced? And can it be duplicated? Okay? Materialization has been duplicated. The phenomena has been duplicated. However, there are new sets of purported phenomena that have not been so easily duplicated. You cannot say that you've had 10 mediums over 150 years do this phenomena. If you don't have that long history of reproducing the phenomena, then it would not be as valid. I'll put it that way. For example, there's a purported medium current day who allegedly apports crystals out of his eyelid. Oh, out of their eyelid. I don't want to gender them. So, well, it might even be on video of this person sticking their finger in their eye and a little crystal popping out. Well, being a researcher of the literature, I have not seen this in the history of mankind. So I'm very skeptical at this new phenomena that doesn't have a track record of being duplicated. And in the same way, there's a purported medium who apports crystals from their mouth. There's not another medium in 150 years that has had that phenomenon. So if it doesn't pass the test of being replicated over time, it should be looked at very, very, very cautiously.
Well, I think caution is always appropriate, but if I look at the history, and in particular your book, there are many unique examples. I'll tell you one that I personally have witnessed, which is, that is, I witnessed the apported object. It was quite unusual from when I was involved in the California Society for Psychical Research. One of the presidents who came before me had attended a seance in which rose petals dropped from the ceiling. They were apported. But if you look at the rose petals carefully, there were photographic images embedded in the rose petals of various personalities. Now, and I saw that. Actual photographs or photographic quality images imprinted on rose petals. Now, I've never seen that before or since, but I actually saw them, and I have no idea. Maybe some skeptic knows a process by which you can imprint photographic images onto rose petals. But as far as I know, this is an authentic example, and it was shown to me by the eyewitness who collected them.
Well, again, I go back to the definition of mediumship. Is it spirit communication, or is it just psychokinesis? And when you mention materialization, there have been materialization seances where facial features, a spirit was materialized with a certain type of broken nose or a Jimmy Durante nose, and they said, "Feel my nose. Isn't that the nose I had in life?" Or another materialization seance had a man with a missing finger, So it goes to also intelligence. What intelligent spirit world entity would put something on a rose petal? For what purpose?
Well, I'm under the impression that the images of people that appeared on the rose petal were the deceased communicators.
I would find that intriguing enough to research it further, but not to draw a conclusion too early.
Fair enough. Let's talk about Helen Duncan. She's one of the great spiritualist mediums who was actually, as I recall, the last person in the United Kingdom ever convicted of witchcraft and was actually put into prison. But from all accounts, she was really a great spiritualist medium.
If you take Helen Duncan as a case study and you look at the full body of her work, the several decades, and much of it has been documented from when she started to develop to when she passed on, purportedly of injuries because of something suffered in a seance. So when you look at her entire body of work, I'm drawn to the beginning of her development. And I see commonalities between her early phenomena and a Polish medium called Kluski that might have been an acquired name, and he was not a professional medium, but his phenomena was very bizarre. I mean, giant birds of prey and wild animals would materialize through his seances. But very early on in Helen Duncan's development as a medium, she had somewhat of that wilder type of materialization before you could assert, before her mediumship developed and the spirit world and her were able to refine her skills. So she is a case study that actually sheds light on the development of a physical materialization medium, and to show that it isn't all as it was in the beginning, it will be at the end. It definitely showed a development.
Many people reported, as I recall, when she was put on trial in the 1940s during the Second World War, many people came to testify as to the authenticity of her mediumship. However, because she was on trial, I gather, for witchcraft, all of this counted against her.
And historians, biographers of Winston Churchill, he was very familiar with Helen Duncan, and he didn't want her on trial. And he believed her, and he thought it was a distraction from the war effort and everything else. So here we have evidence showing sympathetic feelings from Winston Churchill at the time. So, but yes, in one of her seances, a sailor materialized in his sailor uniform, and his cap had the name of his ship, and he said he had passed on when the ship had been torpedoed, but his family wasn't told, and his family went off to the War Office and said, "What happened to my son?" And the War Office said, "Where did you get that information? Is there spies amongst us?" And so that's what the undoing of Helen Duncan was. Her very talent was her undoing.
The reason she was put on trial is because the sinking of that ship was considered a secret that needed to be protected for the war effort, and they were concerned that perhaps the enemy, Germany, would learn about things that were considered secret because of her mediumship.
And then the antiquated laws on the books from 1735, she was branded a witch because that's what the law, that was the term the law used.
Now, I understand subsequently those laws have been changed in order to eliminate mediumship from consideration under the witchcraft laws.
Yes, in fact, in I believe 1951, several prominent mediums, I mentioned Estelle Roberts and Helen Hughes, appeared before their parliament in asking them to repeal this law.
I don't know that you mentioned this in your book, but I'm aware of the fact that Lord Dowding, during the Second World War, who was the Air Marshal in Britain, his wife was a medium, and very often the airmen whose planes were shot down would appear in her seances and basically to check out and report to Lord Dowding that they had been shot down.
Isn't that remarkable? You know, and yes, Lord Dowding and his wife wrote a number of books after the close of the war that were spiritual and on spiritualism, and outlined what you just said.
Now, another very important person in the history of spiritualism is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. the famous author of the Sherlock Holmes mystery stories, a person who, in the popular imagination, he is somebody with a very rigorous, logical mind. In addition, he was a medical doctor, and he was a champion of spiritualism for decades.
If you called Andrew Jackson Davis the St. Paul of spiritualism, Arthur Conan Doyle was the St. Peter, because he used, imagine almost being someone on the scale of the woman who wrote the Harry Potter books. I can't think of her name right now, but she has all this money, or Arthur Conan Doyle had all this money from writing Sherlock Holmes, and he used almost every cent of it traveling the world. He went to America maybe 10, 12 times, which was no small feat back then. He went down to Australia, New Zealand, all spreading the word of life eternal, spiritualism, the eternal nature of our soul, and the possibility of spirit communication. So he, in this St. Peter fashion, just spread, and he was a trusted brand, and he was a great speaker, and he would draw crowds. I believe he went to Carnegie Hall. I don't know if he stopped in Las Vegas where you are, but I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't go out to California.
Well, just for your information, I'm no longer in Las Vegas. I'm talking to you from Albuquerque, where I now live. But one of the interesting things about Conan Doyle is that after he died, there were many, many instances in which he apparently appeared to other people. In fact, today I believe there's an Arthur Conan Doyle Center in Edinburgh, which was founded by a medium who was inspired, who received messages from him, and went and founded that center based on those communications.
After he passed, Lady Doyle, his wife, was inundated with every professional and amateur medium purporting to be in contact with Sir Arthur, and she didn't need any proof, any evidence. But to keep away the hordes of mediums purportedly having a connection with his deceased spirit, she was very standoffish. And there's a story in Great Moments of Modern Mediumship, Volume 2. There are 2 books in which Sir Arthur made contact with an amateur medium, and this medium knew she was kind of out of her league to call Lady Doyle and say, I have the nerve of saying I have Sir Arthur here. But Arthur Conan Doyle impressed the private telephone number on the mind of this amateur medium, and she wrote it down. She heard it clairaudiently, and she said, am I going to dial the number? What am I going to say? So she dialed the number, and they said, yes, this is the private number, and yes, you are so-and-so. You're purporting to be in contact with our husband and our father, but go ahead and bring us more proof. Thank you very much. Or more evidence. And you go back to Apports, this woman being a servant to the spirit world and being a servant to Sir Arthur, said, okay, you gave me the telephone number. I called it. They told me to get more evidence. What are you going to do? true fact, referenced in several books, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle apported the key to his private study. And it was a unique key. She dialed the number back, said, I have the key to his private study. I'll meet with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's son and give him the key as evidence as they requested. And sure enough, through multiple pieces of evidence received in multiple ways, to include Apports, this medium later became the private medium for Lady Doyle, and she convinced her through enough evidence that she did in fact have communication with Sir Arthur.
Well, that's certainly a wonderful story. But I'm under the impression, Maxine, that, and maybe it's simply because I'm looking at things through the lens of parapsychology. It seems as if the great moments of modern mediumship sort of trailed off. We don't hear too much about it in the 21st century.
With the exception of one anecdote in one of the books, I limited my research to dead mediums. So there are mediums out there producing phenomena, but in my research, I avoided them for the sake of compiling all of these case studies. And I will say that the one that I did include had to do with the phenomena of temperature change. Within a mediumistic seance, people have said over the years that they feel the temperature of a seance room get much colder. And in one case that I include in the book, there was a cup of water that was frozen underneath the seat of one of the sitters in a seance as evidence of truly how cold it got. So, but for my research, I limited it, with the exception of that one case, to dead mediums, if you will, or mediums of the past. I did allude to the fact that there are still purported mediums producing some phenomena, but I would say that research worthy, there perhaps is only one who might give permission to be looked at closely as a case study, whether it be through scientific controls. We just don't have this type of phenomena anymore.
One of the sociological connections with spiritualism seems to be warfare. I mean, the Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, all created many bereaved parents who had lost their children and sought mediums. And I wonder if you feel that way. Would you say that spiritualism as a movement is declining?
Instead of being an answer to this problem of grief, a lot of the phenomena has been turned into entertainment. It might be entertaining, but the emphasis in turning it into entertainment or capitalism is definitely not what it was in the past. So this is definitely showing how things have changed.
Well, Maxine Meilleur, this has been a fascinating discussion. I'd love to have more conversations with you. I know that in your 2-volume set of great moments in modern mediumship, there are hundreds of fascinating examples that we haven't begun to touch on. And I know you've also written other books about spirit guides and about healing and even about reading of coffee grounds. I discovered you have a book on that topic as well. So I hope we'll be able to schedule future conversations with you.
I would like that, Jeffrey, and I just want to know, or I just want to tell you that your show spreads the word of parapsychology to whole new audiences, and this phenomena is now ready to be understood all around the world in a very grown-up manner.
Well, Maxine, I want to thank you very much for being with me. And actually, I hope someday we can have a conversation about your own experiences as a medium.
Yes, I could add a story or two to that.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.